Our next speaker is obsessed with guiding organizations to be more human-centric and to prioritize adaptive leadership in the new world of work. She calls herself an agile talent strategist, and she's an international facilitator, speaker, leadership, and coach, and a published author. Anja, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the beautiful introduction, Kevin. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Thank you. So what a lovely way to end a wonderful morning. As I was listening to all the speakers, I thought it's such a beautiful setup for the closing of how do you connect the dots? Because I mean, I can use all the stories that were shared really to have a look at how do we now connect those dots when we think of LMI and the LMI experience. And as you've mentioned, the focus today will be a little bit on, not a little bit, but the focus will be on how do we connect the dots when we look. Let me just get sorted. There we are. Great. So how will we connect the dots looking at different development psychologies? And I want to first of all just thank our master licensee in Lebanon and Cyprus, Jad. Him and his team did a lot of work behind the scenes. And we were actually inspired by a presentation that he did. And we said, okay, that's great. That's great information and valuable insight to share with the people on the call today. And I think when I want you to just imagine that you are one of the leaders in your company that has been tasked to inform or influence the leadership development program. And you actually just don't know where to start. Because I mean, if you think of what you have been exposed to, it might have been emotional intelligence, and you have done a course on that. And you recently had a conversation with your sister, and she might have just completed an NLP workshop, and she said, yes, that's the way to go. Or it might be that you work in the agile environment, and in the agile environment, a lot of focus is on the growth mindset, and you have all the different questions. Where do we need to focus on? I mean, if I just think of what Mavis has shared regarding neuroscience and how our brain influence our leadership styles and what we need to know about influencing other people. And I hope that the end of this session today, that you guys will be a little bit more comfortable connecting the dots when you think of the solutions that LMI has to offer. So before I start any virtual session, I love to start with a little known fact and ask each delegate just to share a little known fact about themselves. It's just, for me, a beautiful way to connect one another. We're all working virtually, and unfortunately today we don't have that luxury. We don't have the luxury of asking each one of you to share a little known fact about yourself. But I thought, let's continue with that tradition of asking, or the ritual asking, for a little known fact. And I want to ask Greg to tell us any little known fact about the founder of LMI. So Greg, I don't know, over to you. What can you share? What little known fact can you share with us?
Well, Jeremiah, an amazing man. I'm one of the few here today that had the opportunity to actually work one-on-one with him. And in 2002, went and spent a whole week with Paul every day for a week, very intense. He's quite an intense man. He started this over 60 years ago, and he's really considered to be one of the founders of the self-development industry in America. And I don't think many people realize that. There's a leadership expert called John Maxwell, who has achieved global leadership fame. And one little known fact is that John Maxwell started his quest to achieve that with an SMI program. And in his words, he said, the day I started my SMI program, I got out of my chuck wagon and got into a bullet train. And that was the significance of the difference it made to John Maxwell's career. Another interesting and hardly ever known fact is that Paul Jeremiah came to South Africa in the 70s, and he was so taken by the Karoo that he actually started an ostrich farm in Texas. And I visited the site where the ostrich farm was. The truth about it was ostriches don't really like Texas. So they didn't thrive. But Paul Jeremiah fell in love with South Africa And that's a little known fact. Thank you, Anja.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think when I started, or when I was introduced to LMI, just to add on to what you said, is to think that he's the pioneer of personal and individual development. And I think that was just amazing to think the richness of the programs that we have the privilege of working with. A little known fact for me as well, and I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, was the whole concept of the wheel of life. So share a little bit about that, Greg.
Well, the wheel of life was developed by Paul, and it's actually probably in use globally by many, many, many coaches and facilitators. So, it was Paul who actually worked on this wheel of life concept, and it's embedded in all of our programs.
Yeah, and I think what was fascinating for me when I realized that is, as you've mentioned, that many of us are trained coaches, and in our coaching programs, we also use some form of the wheel of life concept. But again, to think that our founder was the one that was actually coining the whole concept of a total person in the wheel of life. So yeah, great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think a little known fact about, thank you, Greg. A little known fact for me about the program is really the employee experience, or the delegate experience, when they go through the whole program, and how it's just the whole process and how it fits together. And during the course of this morning, you've heard so many different speakers, calling on different programs, facilitating, using a specific workshop. And I thought it might be, I'm a visual person, and it might be helpful for you to have a look at this picture as well, because it's really explaining to you how all the programs from LMI fits together, starting at where we started with Savannah this morning, looking at the youth program, building on that, the Grand Masters of the Success, Kevin, that you and Stephen spoke about. But I think focusing on leadership development, and where we mentioned that leadership development really starts with the personal development, is then to focus on the triangle and see that there's different layers. And depending where you are in your leadership journey, you can choose the specific workshop that might benefit yourself. So let's then start connecting the dots. And the first one that I would like to focus on, this is just a quick screen grab here. I smiled because when I was introduced to LMI, they all use these different terms. They spoke about EPL and AIE and GMS, and I didn't know what this means. So this is just a cheat sheet for you guys, that all the different workshops and what we actually offer. But I think looking at the development psychologies, I want to start with the emotional intelligence side. And I think for us today, it's critical that we need to focus on emotional intelligence. I think, Sean, it was you mentioned that the fourth industrial revolution actually requires something different from leaders. And in my opinion, I think it's the demand for a leader to connect in a different way, not only with their organization or with their teams, but to connect in a different way with themselves as well. And that's where the emotional intelligence for me really fits in. And we don't have time today to really focus on the detail, but just to remember that there's actually 4 areas when we talk about emotional intelligence to focus on, being the self-awareness, the self-management, the social awareness, and then the relationship management. And I think what Savannah, the youth leader this morning, shared with us, for me, was such a beautiful way of understanding the self-awareness side, where it's really about understanding your story, having a look at the past, and even perhaps your conditioning. The word conditioning has been used a lot during the course of today, and just understand how that fits together. Kevin, when you and Stephanie were talking, I was amazed to hear from her the value that she found when people really understand where they're coming from and really had that self-awareness, sharing that with the team, how their team actually operated on a different level. And I'm also mindful of one of the clients that we're dealing with and his interactions with. He had a partnership in the beginning of his career. He started his own business, very, very excited. And then that past partnerships actually, did not work out so well. And all those trust issues that he is actually bringing with from that experience focus and reminded me on that self-awareness and how important it is for us to understand our patterns of behavior and our patterns of thought. If we then have a look at the self-management side, I think that speaks for itself. And I think of self-management, I always think about the corporate athlete. And I mean, if we just have a look at where we are today and just reflect on the last over a year in the COVID pandemic, I think we all can relate that we had to self-manage ourselves in a different way. Now, when I think of self-management, for me, it's really about that balance between the energy depletion or the stress that we experience and the recovery side, the energy to build on the energy again. And I think that's critical for us as leaders. And so importantly, what you said, I mean, I'm using the term leader, but that can be anyone. It's not necessarily someone with a title. But how do we self-lead in such a way that we have sufficient energy to be resilient and to influence other people? And then thinking of the social awareness and the relationship awareness, for me, that was so evident when the team from Coca-Cola spoke, and they spoke about that toxic environment. And really for us to understand, if we work in an environment where we try to build a different culture, where we try to allow people to speak up, it's so important for us as leaders then to have that social awareness and relationship awareness. Thank you very much for changing the screens, Naomi. I think you can actually just continue doing that. That would be helpful. But just before you move on, looking then at the different programs, you can see how many different programs touch on the emotional intelligence side. And it might not be the focus of the whole program, but there's definitely a focus in each and every module of these programs listed on the screen. And I think if you have a look at the EPL specifically, that is focused on in detail. So let's then move on to the neuroscience. And if you think of neuroscience, there's 4 things that I just quickly want to touch on. I mean, if we want to think about the brain and how our brain influence the work environment, the first thing that comes to mind for me is social safety. And social safety simply means, how do we enable people to feel that they belong and that they make a meaningful contribution? Because what we need to remember is that as soon as someone feels that they belong, they can actually operate at a much higher level and their performance can be a lot higher, which links onto the social safety. And again, what the team from Coca-Cola mentioned was, if we now want these conversations, it might be the difficult conversations to have in that toxic environment, how safe do we create an environment where people feel that they can speak up, that they can actually disagree with you as the leader? A lot of the time we think of or requiring people to be innovative. But what we need to remember that if you don't build this environment of psychological safety, the people will never be innovative because they don't feel safe enough. I think whenever I think of the neuroscience, for me, it's about that continuous learning and that continuous understanding of one another. Mavis was the one that spoke about the Women in Leadership program. And whenever I think of women in leadership, one of the qualities that we have, I think perhaps one of our strengths is that ability to have empathy. And again, the future of work, which is so human-centric, needs that ability to have empathy with our teams. Yes, and there's a difference between if it's cognitive empathy and if it's affective empathy, but the point of the matter is neuroscience, we require people, or we need to have that empathy in order to help our teams be the best version of themselves. I'm not going to elaborate too much on the neuroplasticity. We know it's about that repetition. And I think that is why I love these programs, the spaced repetition, multi-sensory approach that we see in all the LMI programs. And then perhaps just before we move on, why goal setting? And Greg, you have spoken a lot about energy. Why that is so critical is if we set goals, the bigger the goal is, the easier it is for our brains to focus on the small steps or the smaller goals that we put in between. And another thing is the more the goals relate to our values and our own, what's important, our priorities, the easier it is for our brain to focus on it. And again, there you can see all the different programs which touch on it. And I just want to highlight, have a look at the last one, because all these concepts has been woven into the LMI process. Thank you, Naomi. We can move on. So growth mindset, what I would like to mention about the growth mindset is that if we want to be a continuous learner, I think some of the delegates, if I remember correctly, spoken about that personal development, lifelong learner, we need to adopt a mindset of can do. And it's almost as if we need to reframe and rethink how we see failures or how we see mistakes. Because a growth mindset simply means that we're open to experiment, we're open to fail, if I can call it as such, because we see each interaction and each opportunity as a learning opportunity. And again, Naomi, if you can just enter for us, you will see all the different programs that's linked to this concept of the growth mindset. And I think another point which is so important there is the way how we give feedback, the way how we are open to receive feedback. And again, you can see how that change the way that we interact with one another. So if we have a look at the logo therapy, I think I'll shortly just mention this. Most of us have read the book Man's Search for Meaning, or at least know about the book Man's Search for Meaning. And that's a book that was written by Viktor Frankl. He was a Holocaust survivor. And in the 1944s, when he was in the concentration camps, he actually realized that as soon as an individual is linked to a higher purpose, it's almost as if their world change. And I think this is such an important aspect. One of our earlier speakers spoke about the goal setting and how important that is in life, and how important it is to have a plan and follow that plan. And I think this is where the balance comes into our program, where it's not only about the goal setting, but linking it to the purpose and the purpose of the individual. And whenever I think of purpose, it's really about understanding your gifts and sharing that with the world. Now, NLP, I think that's very popular nowadays. NLP is simply about being conscious of how you use words to impact or change your thoughts and your behavior. And again, you will see the NLP aspects all over the LMI programs. Again, it's incorporated in how we actually roll out the program, meaning in the process that we do. It's in the way how we interact with our people, how often we interact, the words that they use in the action plans and the exercises they do, the bi-weekly or weekly goals that you guys set depending on how the program is run. And very importantly, also here, it touches on that intrinsic motivation, being intrinsic motivation, understanding what is really driving me and not necessarily looking at reward and recognition to focus on that. So that's included in all our programs. The CBT, the cognitive behavior therapy, I think that's what we do. In general, if you think of LMI, this is what we supply, thinking of how do we help the individuals to understand how their emotions impact their thinking and how the thinking impact their behaviors. And I think that's in a nutshell what we do. And it's really so many examples were shared this morning of when I change my thinking, I could see that I changed my behavior. But again, just going a little bit deeper and understand that it starts with an emotion. Thank you, Naomi. You can move on. Because on the next slide, I think what we can see here, if you want to understand how LMI changes thinking and behavior, it's really to think of the bad habits the individual want to change. And it might even be that they're totally unconscious about that bad habit, but either listening to the program or reading to the script, something triggers. And in the one-on-one session with a facilitator, they will actually ask about that. And that's how that unconscious inability becomes a little bit conscious. And also very important, we don't stop there. Now that they're consciously aware of that, how do we now transform that into a good habit? Thank you, Naomi. And I think the next slide is so important because it's really showing you guys, we've spoken a lot about conditioning, we've spoken a lot about the word unconsciousness, and what this image simply shows us is that whatever is beneath the waterline, those are the things that we unconsciously, that's unconscious to us. We're not aware of that, and that's the conditioning. And we actually focus on the areas below the waterline, the attitudes, getting new habits in there, in order to change and impact our results. So the humanistic approach, just simply saying we need to have a balance, or let's rather say an overlap between your self-image and how the person that you would like to become. And again, if you think of all the LMO programs, what we have seen, people are a lot less judging towards themselves. They're more present in the moment and lot less judging towards someone else. Thank you, Naomi. You can move on, because the positive psychology, just I think what I will say here, lots of you might follow positive psychology on social media, and all these concepts are in the LMI processes, not only from the process side, but also very specifically in some of the programs. And then perhaps just to summarize, you will see that looking at the different development psychologies and looking at the different programs, here you have a snapshot of how you can connect the dots. And you will see that they most applicable to all the programs that we run. So perhaps just to end my session, I would love to leave you with this thought. And it's a quote from Paul Myers saying, "Life is a painting and you are the artist." And my wish for you today is that you will be inspired by something that someone said today, and that you will reach out to the team to see that it's all in your hands. The paintbrush of what your life and the life that you want to create is focusing on what's your goals, what is it that you want to be clear on, and then just use the tools in order to achieve that. So thank you so much. That was a quick run through of the different psychologies, and I appreciate the opportunity to end today's session with connecting the dots. Thank you, Kevin.
Sorry, Anja, I hope I didn't drive too fast. I was like really trying to dance with you on this one. I was really trying to dance with you on this one. I have a question from the audience asking, you've mentioned spaced repetition and multi-sensory learning. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that is so critical, because for me, Naomi, that links back to the employee or the delegate experience. So first of all, let's say multi-sensory, so important to see it's not someone sitting in a class listening to a lecture. It's really using the ears, the eyes, the writing. So many different aspects are used in our programs. And the spaced repetition is the way that the programs are set up is for you to hear the message repeatedly. So that's what I love. I mean, the app that you can use, that you can listen to the material anytime, anywhere, and then have the manual, or if you do it online, read online. That repetition is so important. And again, that supports the neuroplasticity, creating those neural pathways in your brain.
So Anja, you and I share this passion with all the psychologists, and I love having these conversations with you. And often I have this crossroad when you sit with a client and you explain to them what we do, and they say, yeah, but we prefer sending our guys to a one-day seminar or a quick fix thing. What is your take on that? Yeah,
so I mean, I think in the end, when you connect the dots, and I mean, just looking at the history, it's 60 years of, development being put into these programs is, I think a one day will just not make it. I mean, if we talk about people changing their lives, impacting the way they think, we all know that doesn't happen overnight. I mean, if we want to change habits, we know that doesn't happen overnight. And I mean, here you have the luxury of that, I almost want to say spaced learning. And for me, it's a no-brainer. So, I mean, we saw today connecting the dots. It's included in our programs in any way. So for me, it's a no-brainer.
Thank you, Anja. I don't know, Kevin, Greg, any other questions from your side? I just love this stuff. So thank you, Anja, for that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Greg,
fantastic.
Anything final?
No, Kevin, you might have another question. I the presentation was good. I understand it. I got it. And yeah, I loved it.
Yeah,
Thank
I think
you.
we've got about 1 more minute to squeeze in a question. How important is it understanding the establishment of monitoring and evaluating within an organization to be successful within the role of exco and the player, and how that sort of implements in that environment? I know it's a big question that's been asked, Anja, but you know, everything that we speak about, the psychologies and the importance of it, how do we all tie it back to really keeping track of it all?
Yeah, I think that's such an important one, because it's something so simple. What comes to mind for me is, if we measure, we can celebrate, and we can celebrate small successes. And I think, again, from a neuroscience perspective, that's critical. But again, if you don't measure, if you have a goal and it's not measurable, how would you know you've achieved it? Yeah. So for me, it's critical that when you think of goals, to know, okay, but what does success look like? So for me, it's really a no-brainer. It is part of the process, but I think it's also, as I said, to celebrate small successes and to actually reflect on just how far have I come. Yeah. So measure, I think, is important.
Have the champagne.
Think of the exco team.
Thank you. And
the fridge, yeah.
just a comment from Michael Sampson saying, wonderful presentations. Thanks to the LMI South Africa. You guys are awesome. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Anja. That was fantastic. And thank you for tying it all together. I love the little dots. You definitely have to share that with us. It makes such wonderful sense. Thank you for that.